All right, now the National Cohesion and Integration Commission recently listed 23 counties that are considered potential violence hotspots ahead of the country's August 2022 elections. This was part of the Commission's efforts to ensure a peaceful election. Well, Kenya's past polls have seen high levels of violence, and tonight's conversation is on how to break that pattern and what the key drivers of election-related violence are. Joining me in studio now is NCIC Commissioner Danvers Makori and human rights lawyer Christine Alai. Thank you both for coming in.
Thank you, Rachel.
Let me begin with you, Commissioner, because recently NCIC released a hotspot map as well as a hate speech action plan. So very detailed reports as to what you'll actually do to address hate speech and other drivers of election-related violence. But, you know, from where you sit, and I'm sure you've done a lot of research, you've gone to the ground, you've spoken to the people, what is the most concerning aspect of election-related violence for the Commission right now?
Thanks, Vicky, for having me. It's always a pleasure to be here. I'm glad that you mentioned that aspect of that study, because it was the social construct was focusing on what the people perceive.
Right.
Because we are on the ground, what are people saying, what are they feeling? And their concern especially, their number one concern is lack of trust. The government institutions, including us, including all EMBs, all agencies that are working on election. So the number one is, whether it's us, whether it's IBC, the judiciary, or the police, National Police Service, and I'm being very genuine with you, that was their number one concern.
Where did that lack of trust come from? Was it lack of action from?
No, I think it's historical. They're coming. They look at the past action of relevant government agencies on this, and to an extent, it's perception, one part, and there's also the reality of it, in the impartiality of government agencies, the inaction of lack of action of government agencies, especially when it comes to election violence or even other violence or even the conflict systems that we do. So that is actually their main concern. Are we, as government or government agencies, independent agencies, are we going to be impartial? Are we going to be effective? Are we going to be bold so that we can manage this election process in a fair and just manner? That was their main concern as far as the citizens are concerned of our country.
Oh, Christine, let me bring you in here, because when we're looking at key drivers of violence, sexual violence oftentimes is not looked at or given the attention that it really deserves when we talk about elections. Why is that?
Well, thank you, Vicky, for having me on the show. First and foremost, the greatest concern is that as a society, we have over time tolerated the occurrence of sexual and gender-based violence. So that even when it comes to a period of elections, the commission of sexual and gender-based violence, whether it be in the context of campaigns, whether it be in the context of nominations, or even more actively when election outcomes are contested, is not something that, you know, worries the country enough for it to receive the attention that it deserves. Hence, even in periods such as post-election violence 2007, 2008 or 2017, whereas you had the state responding to issues such as displacement in a very robust manner, for instance, or police shootings to some extent. To date, survivors of sexual and gender-based violence from 2007, 2008 are still waiting, even just for mere recognition, let alone some form of rehabilitation or reparation for the physical or psychological harms that they suffered. And that's no different from the reality today. Reports are received not just in the media, but even within our own communities. We see soaring incidences of SGBV, but not enough responses to be able to deal with it. And this is born from the causes of gender-based violence, which really emanate from our societal beliefs and practices that discriminate against especially women and girls. But we're finding that this gender-based beliefs and practices are even now permeating into violence against men and boys. You know, and even oftentimes drives the forms of gender-based violence that we see against men and boys during violence in elections. Forced circumcision, for instance, in 2007, 2008, was actually born out of a belief that for you to be man enough, you ought to be circumcised. And therefore, the use of forced genital mutilation or forced circumcision was actually a very loud statement, which was gender-based. And so as we get into elections, we have to bear in mind that those structural factors remain intact.
Okay.
And they're certainly going to affect the kinds of violations that women and girls, as well as men and boys, are likely to encounter.
You know, Commissioner, you mentioned, well, trust as one of the issues that you're noticing on the ground, you know, when you speak to Kenyans about their concerns. But in this particular election cycle, what are some key drivers that you're noticing could be unique from past election cycles?
So we have what we call exogenous factors, external factors that are not directly, you can say that it's election related. So just even the state of the economy right now, high inflation, bringing instability to our country, high inequality, because inflation brings inequality, because how inflation affects you is not necessarily equal how it affects somebody else in the lower income bracket. So that brings issues. We are seeing a proliferation of drug and drug abuse. It's especially in informal settlements in major cities in our country. It was never like that in 2017, never like that in 2013. But now with like exponential use and actually abuse of drugs coming from the north. I mean, I mean, when you look at the study that we've done and other government agencies that we work with, I mean, it's a really driver to election violence and a trigger actually. The other one actually is the presence of criminal gangs. We have seen, because of various factors, especially in Nairobi, Nakuru, and Mombasa. Just for example, Mombasa has 93 identified criminal gangs, just in Mombasa only. You know, so that presents, I mean, a quick trigger for election violence, right. and that's why we work with our agencies to make sure at least we can mitigate as much as we can. Those are the drivers. Actually, those are triggers. So we have what we triggers. We have structural issues that are there, and then we have institutional issues. Like I said, how the community or citizens of Kenya perceive the government. So when you look at those, all of that combined, actually, then you get a bigger picture of where we stand as a nation.
You know, Christine, I want to go back to something that you had said in terms of many of the victims, at least from 2007, 2008, not having gotten justice to date. You know, I was looking at some numbers from the Waki Commission that documented 900 cases of sexual violence. And you're thinking, we can capture numbers quite well. But when does it then translate to ensuring perpetrators are brought to book? So looking at the solutions where we can actually see some of these individuals be vindicated.
Absolutely. There's a huge gap, and it starts from the preparedness. Right now, you have seen that there's a lot of activity within various state institutions, the National Police Service. Commissioner has just mentioned about the NCIC putting in place various measures. Right. ODPP, and the Chief Justice recently announcing that they're going to appoint special prosecutors and special magistrates to deal with electoral offences. Where the gap arises is the assumption that all forms of violence can be dealt with through a blanket mechanism. And so what has been happening time and again is, for instance, when the contingency plans are put in place, there's a lack of incorporation of specialized expertise, for instance, in risk assessment, to be able to ensure that when you're looking at vulnerabilities, you're able to identify where risks lie for the potential of gender-based violence. But beyond that is that you then accompany those contingency measures with sufficient resources. In the gap analysis that we did in 2017, we established that the contingency preparedness plan was only implemented about 4 weeks to elections. And I wonder now as we speak whether in fact there have been sufficient deployments to the county levels. Right. We had pomp when we launched the contingency plan, but what has followed after? And in fact, we have seen, particularly as we look to the 2017 experience, despite the fact that we had the 20708 experience where government said we were caught flat-footed. Nobody could have anticipated that level of widespread violence. We knew in 2017 that we could have anticipated it. And we know now that we certainly can anticipate it. But do we have sufficient resources, expertise to accompany effective response? When it comes to response, again, we have failed to acknowledge the existing barriers for survivors of sexual and gender-based violence. So that you will hear police, for instance, reporting that they now have a hotline number where survivors can call which survivor is going to court?